Right now, almost every major economic warning sign in the US is flashing red. Beef cattle stocks have hit a 7-5-year low, grocery prices are climbing again, and this time, the problems aren't temporary, they're structural. Supply chain experts, those who actually move your food from farm to shelf, say they're already feeling systemic stress. And with nearly $200 billion in new trade costs injected into a food system that's already stretched thin, this isn't just a recession warning, this is a food access warning. But here's the thing, it doesn't hit every state the same way. Some could lose every highway tomorrow and still feed themselves for months. Others? One bad month, one disruption, one economic shock, and shelves could go bare milk, meat, produce, gone. Not in some distant doomsday scenario, but in real time. Wondering which state's gonna be hit first? Check out our list. If your state is mentioned, your grocery store could look very different this fall. And even if it's not, you'll want to see exactly where it lands, because the margin between fine and fragile is thinner than most people realize. Let's dive right in. If you've ever been to Hawaii, or even just thought about it, chances are a familiar image comes to mind. Fully stocked shelves, fresh fruit, a pleasant atmosphere, and a pace of life that seems more stable than the rest of the United States. But behind that calm, Hawaii's food system doesn't appear as secure as many might think. Hawaii is unlike any other state. It is almost a completely isolated system. There are no roads connecting it to other states, no flexible transportation options like the mainland, and the entire food supply system seems to depend on a single route: sea transport. Under normal conditions, this might not cause significant issues, but any disruption, even a small one, seems to leave little buffer to absorb the shock. In fact, around 85 to 90% of Hawaii's food is imported from the mainland. This is not just a number, it's a clear reminder of the level of dependency. Essential items like milk, fresh vegetables, and meat most are not produced locally at a scale large enough to meet demand. This creates a unique situation, an American state that cannot sustain its basic food supply if outside sources are disrupted. The food transportation chain to Hawaii is also less diverse than in many other places. Most goods are shipped by sea, pass through ports, and then reach distribution centers before reaching consumers. There aren't many of these centers, and each link in the chain is critical. If one link fails, such as port congestion, higher shipping costs, or vehicle shortages, the entire system can be affected like a chain reaction. And because there are no truly viable alternatives, the ability to pivot in the short term seems very limited. Many might assume Hawaii could rely entirely on local agriculture to reduce this dependency. However, the reality is much more complicated. Volcanic terrain, limited land, and high production costs make large-scale farming difficult. Over the years, a significant portion of farmland has been converted to urban or tourism purposes. As a result, local production exists, but is not strong enough to serve as a backup when external supply faces issues. When imports slow, local agriculture does not seem able to accelerate fast enough to fill the gap. Weather factors also add to the risk. Hawaii frequently faces heavy rain, flooding, and extreme weather events. These events not only cause temporary damage, but can also affect long-term agricultural productivity. When a system already heavily dependent on imports faces unstable local production, the risk is no longer one-dimensional. It becomes a combination of multiple factors simultaneously. Additionally, Hawaii's economic structure plays a significant role. Tourism is the main economic sector, and when visitor numbers drop, residents' incomes are affected. This impacts not only spending power, but also the entire food distribution system. There have been times when restaurant closures cause farmers to lose their markets, and the supply chain could not adapt quickly enough. This shows that food isn't just about transport or production, it's closely tied to the flow of money in the economy. Looking at the map of the United States, Alaska always feels like its own world, vast, majestic, and somewhat detached. But perhaps more notable than the landscape is how food reaches this state. While other states are connected by dense logistics networks with multiple layers of backup, Alaska resembles an endpoint of the journey where everything has to travel a longer distance, with fewer options and seemingly little room for error. Most food in Alaska appears to start its journey from Washington, especially around the Seattle area. From there, goods are shipped by sea to the port of Anchorage and then continue through in-state distribution. A journey spanning thousands of kilometers, and it's not just distance, but time, cost, and risk accumulating along the way. Many people might not think much about this when they enter a grocery store. Shelves are full, everything seems normal, but behind that normalcy, the system operates in a rather fragile way. When transport times are long, fresh food becomes more sensitive, more vulnerable to any delays. More importantly, this distance causes Alaska to respond more slowly to fluctuations. If supply changes at the origin, it may take many days or longer for the effect to actually appear there. And you know what's worse? This transport system doesn't seem to have many alternatives. Most goods pass through a few main routes, especially the sea route from Seattle. Some areas have additional air or road access, but with over 85% of communities only reachable by air or water, the actual options are limited. This creates a model that could be called a single corridor. In such models, everything usually runs smoothly, until one point fails. When the weather is worse than expected, fuel costs change, or one transport link is delayed, the entire system seems to have few ways to adjust. Dependence on external sources is also a factor that cannot be ignored. Estimates suggest that most supermarket food in Alaska comes from other states, possibly around 90–95%. True, Alaska still has local food sources, from fishing to traditional hunting. But these are likely supplemental rather than replacements for the modern retail system most residents rely on daily. Another rarely discussed but impactful weakness lies in storage capacity. Many cold storage facilities, especially in remote communities, are limited. This means food is not only difficult to bring in, but also hard to keep if any disruption occurs. In a system like this, time becomes a critical factor. Many stores in Alaska only maintain 3 to 5 days of inventory. This just-in-time model is efficient under stable conditions but quite sensitive to disruptions. If a shipment is delayed or a transport route temporarily stops, the impact can appear on shelves quickly. Then there's weather a factor. Alaskans know better than anyone, which acts as an unpredictable variable. Snow, strong winds, limited flying conditions all can slow or completely halt transport. In some cases, communities can be isolated for several days. At that point, the supply chain isn't just long, it becomes seasonally disrupted, even on a weekly basis. At the same time, Alaska's economy is closely tied to energy, particularly oil and gas. This creates a unique cycle. When energy prices change, food transport costs change too. And when residents' income is affected, their ability to afford essentials may also shift. In other words, food here is influenced from both sides' delivery costs and purchasing power. Whenever Nevada is mentioned, many people probably think immediately of the bright lights of Las Vegas, a place where everything seems always available, always running smoothly, and always ready to serve. But if you look a little deeper, especially at the food system behind that glamorous facade, the picture may not be so simple. Nevada, by nature, does not seem built to sustain itself. With an estimated agricultural self-sufficiency rate below 3%, the state almost entirely lacks a strong enough food production base to support internal demand. This is largely due to natural conditions, arid climate, limited water resources, and much of the land unsuitable for large-scale farming. According to USDA data, agriculture here plays only a very small role, more supplemental than foundational. As a result, most of the food Nevada residents consume daily seems to have to come from outside, particularly from states like California, Arizona, and Utah. These supply chains operate fairly efficiently under normal conditions, but are almost entirely dependent on the stability of other states. When California's supply is affected by drought or transportation costs rise, Nevada seems to have few ways to adjust on its own. Nevada's desert geography also makes the system more sensitive. Goods must travel long distances under high temperatures, significantly increasing storage and transportation costs. Some analyses suggest that transport routes in such harsh environments face higher pressures, not just in cost, but in reliability. This means Nevada depends not only on external supply, but also on the ability to maintain the flow of goods through a challenging environment. However, perhaps the most notable factor lies in the economic structure. Nevada, particularly Las Vegas, relies heavily on tourism and service industries. In favorable periods, this cash flow helps maintain purchasing power, keeping the retail system running smoothly. But when visitor numbers drop, incomes can fluctuate accordingly, leading to changes in consumer behavior. In other words, Nevada's food system seems to depend not only on whether goods are transported, but also on whether residents can afford them. This is a key difference compared to states with more diversified economies. Another less obvious but fundamental factor is water. Nevada relies heavily on Lake Mead and the Colorado River sources under increasing stress. Water levels at Lake Mead have dropped significantly in recent years, raising concerns about long-term water sustainability. This not only affects daily life, but directly limits the potential for agricultural development, a sector already very weak in the state. Meanwhile, Nevada's food retail system operates on a low inventory model, similar to many other places in the U.S. Supermarkets do not maintain long-term stock, but rely on continuous deliveries from out-of-state distribution centers. This model optimizes costs but makes the system sensitive to disruptions. When shipments slow down, the impact can appear much faster than many might expect. Mississippi has long been among the states with the lowest household incomes in the United States. This is not news. But in the context of food prices becoming increasingly sensitive to transportation, fuel, and supply chain costs, it takes on a different meaning. When most income is already allocated to basic needs, even a small price fluctuation can create a feeling of being squeezed, not in a dramatic sense, but quietly and persistently. And perhaps what many find confusing is this: Mississippi is not short on farmland. In fact, the state has considerable agricultural production. But if you look closely at USDA data, most of what is grown is not directly what appears on the daily dinner table. Soybeans, corn, cotton. These crops primarily serve export markets, animal feed, or other industries. Ironically, Mississippi may grow a lot, but not necessarily what local residents need to eat every day. This creates a somewhat strange gap between on-paper supply and food in the shopping cart, and when that gap combines with low income, it seems to become a form of pressure not always visible from the outside. Food insecurity rates in Mississippi remain high compared to the national average. This means that even without any major disruptions in the supply chain, a significant portion of residents struggles to maintain a stable diet. In other words, the problem likely existed before it just hasn't received much attention. Then there's the distribution story. Not every area of the state has equal access to food. In cities, options may be more diverse, but in rural areas, where distances are greater and population density lower, many people depend on small stores with higher prices and limited selections. And if you've lived long enough to notice the difference between a large supermarket and a small local shop, you probably understand what that means. No more low prices at Walmart or Costco, fewer choices, higher prices. And sometimes, you have to accept what is available rather than what you actually want to buy. Another less discussed factor that directly affects daily life is food quality. According to multiple sources, Mississippi has higher rates of nutrition-related issues than many other states. This isn't necessarily because residents don't care about health, but may simply reflect budget-limited choices. When fresh food is often more expensive, many are forced to choose cheaper options, and over time, this can create consequences not easily reversed. Louisiana does not seem to be a place lacking food in the traditional sense. Goods still move through the state, sometimes in large volumes, especially via major transit points like the Port of New Orleans. But there is a subtle irony, perhaps slightly unsettling if you think about it, that food passing through a place does not necessarily mean it is easy to stay there or within reach of the people living there. Here's a fun fact for you. Louisiana has long been among the states with high poverty rates. By itself, this may not be enough to create a crisis. But when combined with USDA data showing relatively high reliance on food assistance programs like SNAP, the picture becomes clearer and perhaps a little heavier. A significant portion of residents may be living in a state where access to food is not entirely in their own hands, but depends on whether the support system is running smoothly. And if you've ever relied on a system like that, you probably understand the feeling everything is fine until it's not. Food insecurity in Louisiana is not new. It seems to have existed for years, quietly, without much noise, but enough to create a fairly fragile foundation. It is noteworthy that in such systems, crises often do not start from zero. They start from a point already weak, and just a slight push can make everything slide faster than people expect. Then there is a factor Louisiana seems more familiar with than any other state: disruption. Events like Hurricane Katrina left not only a historical mark, but perhaps a kind of system memory, where infrastructure, logistics, and even community psychology carry cracks that have not fully disappeared. The issue is that Louisiana's transportation system relies heavily on key arteries, waterways, seaports, and several main routes. Under normal conditions, this can be very efficient, but when a node fails, the impact does not seem to stop there. It tends to ripple outward, like a weak link in an already stretched chain. Looking at the nature of supply, Louisiana also does not appear to be fully self-sufficient. Many essential food items still have to come from elsewhere, from other states, or from outside the country. This may not be a major issue when everything is running smoothly, but in a context of fluctuating transportation costs, or when disruptions occur, it becomes a factor that makes prices less predictable. West Virginia is not like places where a crisis hits suddenly like a shock. It seems more like something smoldering, a prolonged state where pressure never really disappears, just always there, low enough not to cause panic, but high enough that no one truly feels comfortable. According to multiple data sources, household incomes here are often below the national average. And if you look further at data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a familiar picture emerges: low labor force participation. Many areas once reliant on industries like coal mining, which, to put it mildly, no longer provide the stability they once did. If you belong to a generation that saw times when a stable job could support a whole family, this feeling may not be unfamiliar. Everything does not collapse immediately, it just slows down, then contracts. And eventually, it seems, it is no longer enough. Like several places mentioned earlier, geography also makes West Virginia more vulnerable. Hills, winding roads, long distances, all of this makes delivering food to each community more complicated. The terrain is not really suitable for large-scale agriculture. This means the state relies heavily on external supplies. And as anyone who has followed supply chains knows, dependence on outside sources usually works very well until it stops working smoothly. Perhaps what makes the picture heavier is the factor of time. West Virginia has not faced these challenges for just 1 or 2 years. Many communities here have experienced shortages in the past, and recovery does not always seem complete. What happened before does not disappear, it accumulates, bit by bit. The retail system reflects this as well. In many places, especially remote areas, large supermarkets are not a given. Instead, there are small shops and convenience stores where prices are usually higher and selections more limited. And if you've ever shopped under these conditions, you probably understand the feeling of choosing what's available instead of choosing what you want. Perhaps the first thing to understand is this: New Mexico is not short on space, but it seems short on systems. Communities are spread out, sometimes far from even the main transportation routes. This means that every carton of milk, every bunch of vegetables on the shelf is not just a commodity, it is the result of a long journey, sometimes longer than necessary. And when most of the supply comes from other states like Texas or Arizona, the question is not, is it available, but perhaps when will it arrive and at what cost? Distance, in this case, seems to be more than just geographic. It becomes part of the cost of living. When fuel rises, when operating costs increase, when supply chains start to feel pressure, states at the end of the line like New Mexico seem to feel it the most. Not because they are doing anything wrong, but simply because they are not the first priority. Then there is another issue, rarely spoken aloud. The transportation system here seems to have few alternatives. A few main routes carry the bulk of goods. That works, until it doesn't. Just a small disruption, bad weather, logistics, delays, or simply pressure from elsewhere in the supply chain, and some areas can almost be cut off from the flow for a period of time. Not forever, but long enough for people to start noticing that things are not as normal as they thought. What makes this picture more complicated may lie in the people themselves. New Mexico has long been among the states with below-average median income. Many families rely on food assistance programs to maintain a stable life, and here, a paradox seems to appear. Food may still exist somewhere in the system, but access does not always come with it. A slight price increase elsewhere may be just a nuisance. But here, it can become a decision that requires careful consideration. In reality, these signs do not seem new. During past slowdowns in the supply chain, some areas of New Mexico have experienced basic items like milk or fresh vegetables becoming harder to find than usual, not because they ceased to exist, but because they did not arrive in time or in sufficient quantity. And when someone has to drive dozens of miles just to find a store fully stocked with fresh food, the problem is no longer about shopping habits. Arizona, in many ways, seems to be trying to sustain a growth rate faster than its capacity to self-supply. Agriculture here depends heavily on water, a resource not always abundant in the desert. Many may remember periods when water became a constant topic, not because it disappeared, but because it started to become unpredictable. Meanwhile, the population continues to grow. People come for opportunity, for the weather, for a familiar sense of Western freedom. But farmland does not increase at the same pace. And so, a gap begins to form not immediately, but clearly enough to notice. The number of people who need to be fed seems to be growing faster than the capacity for local production. When that happens, the system becomes more reliant on outside supply. And like many other states in the region, Arizona depends on long transportation routes, bringing food from far away. That works. Until costs begin to rise, or when the supply chain feels pressure from multiple sides. But perhaps the less spoken factor lies in the weather itself. High temperatures affect not just people, but also directly impact how food is stored. Cold storage systems in Arizona, in many cases, must operate under harsher conditions than normal. And when temperatures rise, the cost of keeping food fresh also rises. Any disruption, no matter how small in this cold chain, can have consequences that appear quickly. Another notable point is the state's economy, which, though growing, is somewhat concentrated in sensitive sectors like real estate and tourism. These areas can bring rapid growth, but also tend to be cyclical. And when cash flow slows, or when living costs increase, residents may feel pressure not in distant problems, but in everyday necessities. Perhaps this is why the issue in Arizona is not just lack of food. It seems to be something subtler, the ability to maintain the stability of fresh food in a system already under pressure. It is not that shelves will empty immediately, but choices may gradually diminish, prices may become more sensitive, and things once taken for granted start to require consideration. Rhode Island does not have much farmland. This is not a secret. But what is perhaps more notable is the almost total dependence on external supply. Food comes from other states, from larger distribution systems, from transportation routes that Rhode Island does not really control. When everything runs smoothly, this does not seem to cause any issues. But when there is any delay, questions begin to arise. How much backup does such a small place have to withstand shocks? And the answer seems to be not much. Perhaps the most thought-provoking point is this: Rhode Island does not really have a buffer system, a layer to absorb shocks, not because they do not want one, but perhaps because the size of the state does not allow it to exist at a sufficient scale. When larger states can manage by redirecting domestic supply or adjusting distribution systems, Rhode Island seems to have to wait and hope that goods from outside continue to flow. And when it comes to the most vulnerable types of food, the answer is probably not surprising. Frozen goods items that might seem like they can last longer depend heavily on a stable storage and distribution system. If cold storage is not large enough, if the transport chain is disrupted, even products considered reserve can become scarce in ways few would expect. Looking more broadly, Rhode Island does not appear to be a story of mistakes or poor management. It seems more like a textbook example of a system overly dependent on the outside without sufficient internal buffers. And perhaps what makes people pause is not whether the state can adapt, but how much time it will have to adapt when things no longer go as they are used to. At first glance, New Jersey might feel like one of the more reassuring places. Close to major economic centers, densely populated, incomes are not low, and things seem always available. But there is a question rarely asked. What happens if the flow of goods, the thing this state relies on heavily, starts to slow down, even slightly? Perhaps the most notable point lies in the fairly obvious imbalance between population and farmland. New Jersey is not short on people, but it does not have much land to produce food on a large enough scale. This means that most of what appears on daily plates comes from elsewhere. And in a system where everything depends on continuous operation, the idea that everything is always available seems more a result of smooth functioning than a guarantee. This dependence, under normal conditions, may not cause any particular feeling, but when placed in the context of rising transportation costs, increased logistics pressure, and overburdened routes, the story looks different. New Jersey is close to major ports and important trade routes, but that also means it frequently faces congestion. Goods still arrive, yes, but not always quickly, and not always at a comfortable cost. A state that seems not short of money, where many have worked a lifetime to achieve financial stability, it can find itself in a situation where the issue is not affordability, but that prices are gradually exceeding reasonable limits. When transportation, storage, and distribution costs rise, food prices follow. And over time, this can create the sense that while everything is still there, it is no longer easily within reach as before. When all these factors are considered together, from geography, weather, and transportation costs to economic structure and domestic self-sufficiency, the picture of food security in states like Hawaii, Alaska, Nevada, Mississippi, and Louisiana begins to emerge more clearly. It is not an immediate disaster, but there appear to be hidden vulnerabilities where a small change in the supply chain, prices, or resources could have rapidly spreading effects. We want to hear your thoughts. Do you see your state among the more vulnerable areas? Or do you think there are other factors we haven't considered? Share your perspective and story in the comments below. Finally, please note that the information in this video is based on publicly available sources and official reports. It is intended for general exploration and informational purposes about different U.S. states. If you are considering living, investing, or traveling, be sure to review official sources and consider your personal needs before making any decisions. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.